The grand windows of the Van Clare Music Academy had gone dark, turning into mirrors that reflected the quiet city street. Inside, the only light came from a single practice room on the second floor, a warm box of gold in the cavernous, shadowed hallway. Inside that box, a girl played. Her name was Alara, and her fingers, long and sure, flew across the keys of a Steinway grand piano. The music was a storm by Rachmaninoff, all crashing chords and desperate, running notes. It sounded impressive, like thunder in a bottle, but if you really listened, you could hear the gears turning. It was perfect, and it was empty dot. She finished the section with a hard slam on the final keys. The note rang out, then died into a thick silence she hated. She groaned, dropping her head into her hands, her dark hair falling like a curtain. Again, she whispered to herself. You have to get it right. Her teacher had said the notes were flawless, but the soul was missing. Where is the heart, Alara? He'd asked, tapping his own chest. I hear a brilliant machine, not a weeping man. The criticism burned worse than if she'd played the wrong notes dot as she sat there. Fuming, a soft, rhythmic sound seeped into the silence from the hallway. Asterisk swish. Thump, swish. Thump. Asterisk, it was the sound of the night janitor at work. Alara didn't know his name. Nobody did. He was just a part of the building's nighttime rhythm, like the hum of the coolers or the creak of old floorboards. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a quiet face that seemed carved from weathered wood. His movements were slow, careful, as he pushed his wide mop bucket along the polished marble floor. He never made eye contact, never made a sound beyond his work. Tonight, his presence grated on her. Her frustration was a live wire, and his quiet, methodical cleaning felt like an intrusion. She wanted to be alone with her failure. The swish thump was like a clock ticking down to her next lesson. Another session of hearing, she was emotionally deaf dot. She launched into the difficult passage again. It was a torrent of notes, a technical beast. Halfway through, her fourth finger stumbled, hitting a sour note that clashed horribly in the cascade of sound. Ooh! She cried out, pulling her hands back as if the keys had burned her. The swishing outside her door stopped. She could feel his presence in the doorway, a shadow in her peripheral vision. He was just standing there, leaning on his mop, probably waiting for her to leave so he could clean her room and go home. The thought made her irritation flare. She spun on the piano bench to face him. Do you need something? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. The man just shook his head slowly, his eyes on the floor. He made to move away. Something in Alara broke. It was the pressure, the sleepless nights, the hollow perfection of her playing. This silent, invisible man became the target for all of it. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her. It's just, she said, waving a hand at the magnificent piano. If you think it looks so easy, why don't you give it a try? The man froze. He finally looked up, and his eyes were a pale, watery blue. There was no anger in them, just a deep, tired emptiness. He shook his head again. Alara pushed. The words came out coated in sarcasm, a defense mechanism she'd perfected. No, really. I insist. Come on. Play something for me. She gestured grandly at the instrument. You see, I'm stuck. Maybe you can show me how it's done. He mumbled something, his voice a low, gravelly sound. I just clean, miss. Everyone can play something, Alara pressed, the joke taking a cruel shape in her mind. It was a way to release the steam inside her. She leaned forward, a mocking smile on her lips. Tell you what, you sit down here and you play me something. Something that doesn't sound like a cat walking on the keys. She let the challenge hang in the air, then delivered the punchline with a theatrical chuckle. Play and I will marry you. She grinned, waiting for the awkward shuffle, the muttered apology, the retreat. She had put the strange, quiet man in his place. He would vanish back into the shadows, and she could go back to hating her own playing in peace. But he didn't move. He stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted in those pale eyes. The emptiness seemed to swirl, replaced by something else, a flicker of memory, a ghost of pain, or maybe just a profound weariness with being unseen. Very slowly, without breaking his gaze, he set the mop handle against the wall. It made a soft clack against the wooden doorframe. Then he walked into the room. He didn't walk like a janitor. His shoulders, usually hunched, straightened. His steps, usually a shuffle, became deliberate and quiet. He moved past her, and she caught a faint smell of soap and old wool. He stood before the piano, looking down at the sleek black lid and the ivory keys. For a second, Elira thought he might just wipe it with a cloth. But then he reached out a hand. It was a broad, strong hand, crisscrossed with old scars and calluses from his work. He ran a single thick finger along the edge of the piano's lid, a touch so gentle it was almost a caress. Then he lowered himself onto the bench she had just vacated. It was her spot. The space still held the warmth from her body. He adjusted the bench, his movements economical, expert. He placed his work-roughened hands in his lap, staring at the keys. Alara's smirk had vanished. A cold trickle of surprise ran down her spine. This wasn't going according to her script. "Look, I was just kidding." She started, but her voice trailed off. He didn't seem to hear her. He was somewhere else. He took a deep, slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling. The air in the room changed. It became charged, heavy, like the moment before a lightning strike. He raised his hands. They hovered over the keys, those scarred, cleaning-worn hands. And then they transformed. The calluses seemed to melt away. His fingers arched with a graceful, powerful curve she'd only seen in master classes. His wrists floated with a relaxed poise that spoke of 1,000 hours of practice. He didn't play the Rachmaninoff. He didn't play Für Elise or chopsticks. His fingers descended, and the first chord filled the small room. It was a sound Alara had never heard before. It was deep, a groaning from the earth itself, a note of such profound sadness that it stole the breath from her lungs. It hung in the air, vibrating in the wood of the floor, in the bones of the piano, in her own chest. And then the other hand moved, a melody rising from the bass like a ghost from a grave. It was intricate, weaving through strange, beautiful harmonies that felt both ancient and brand new. It was a story without words. It spoke of loss, of a love so deep its absence was a physical ache. It spoke of empty rooms and silent laughter. There were flashes of anger, sharp and discordant, that shattered into showers of glittering, high notes like tears. Gilara stood utterly still, her back pressed against the cool wall. Her heart was hammering. This wasn't a janitor playing a joke. This was a composer, a virtuoso, a man who knew the piano as an extension of his own soul. The technique was blinding passages that made her Rachmaninoff look like a child's exercise, executed with a control that was effortless, instinctive. He played with his eyes closed, his face a landscape of feeling. The weary lines were still there, but now they were channels for sorrow, for memory. He was no longer in the practice room. He was somewhere far away, in a place made of this music, the piece built to a furious, roaring climax, a storm of grief, before collapsing back into a single, pure, heartbreaking melody in the upper register. It repeated softer and softer, until it was just a whisper of sound, a breath on the keys. And then it was over. The last vibration faded into a silence that was louder than any chord. The man's hands went limp in his lap. He sat there, head bowed, as if waking from a deep, painful dream. The spell was broken. The maestro was gone, and the tired janitor sat in his place. He stood up, the movement stiff now. He didn't look at Elara. His eyes were on the floor again. He walked past her, the smell of soap and wool returning. He picked up his mop from against the door-frame dot without a single word. He pushed his bucket into the dark hallway. The soft asterisk swish, thump asterisk resumed, growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the sleeping building. Elara was alone. The room felt colder, bigger. The grand piano seemed to look at her, a silent witness to a secret it would never tell. She looked at her own hands, the hands that could play every note correctly and feel nothing. And for the first time in her life, Elara, the prodigy, understood she knew absolutely nothing about music at all. The silence after the janitor left was the loudest thing Elara had ever heard. It wasn't empty. It was full. It buzzed with the ghost of the music, a ringing in her ears that felt like it was inside her skull. She couldn't move from her spot against the wall. Her legs felt like they were made of sand. She stared at the piano bench. It was just a polished wooden seat, still slightly pushed back from where he had been sitting. But in her mind, it was glowing. A part of her expected him to walk back in, to say something, anything. But the only sound was the distant, fading squeak of his mop bucket wheels turning a corner. Slowly, as if walking on ice, she shuffled forward. She lowered herself onto the bench. It was still warm. The thought sent a strange shiver through her. She placed her hands on the keys where his had been. They felt different. They felt alive, like they were still humming with the energy he'd poured into them. Her own touch suddenly seemed clumsy, childish. She tried to remember a single note of what he'd played. A phrase, anything, but it was like trying to catch smoke. The music had been too complex, too personal. It wasn't a series of notes to memorize. It was a flood of feeling she had only been able to stand in. Stunned, her mind replayed the last few minutes on a frantic, broken loop. Her own mocking words, asterisk play, and I will marry you. She cringed, the heat of shame rushing to her face. It was a stupid, cruel joke. And then his hands. The transformation. The way his shoulders had straightened. The look on his face like a man returning to a home that had burned down years ago. Who was he? The question hit her like a physical thing. For 2 years, she had seen him. A fixture. Part of the furniture. A man who emptied trash cans and wiped fingerprints off door handles. She had never wondered if he had a name, a life, a story. He was just the quiet man who made the halls clean. Now, that idea seemed impossible. That man was a phantom. The real man, the one who had just sat here, was someone else entirely. A musician of a level she had only ever seen in grainy black-and-white documentaries. A composer. A genius hiding in plain sight, polishing the floors of his own forgotten kingdom. A sudden, sharp noise made her jump. It was the old steam radiator in the corner, knocking to life, a routine sound she never noticed. But now it felt like an intrusion. The real world was coming back, and it seemed cheap and loud compared to the world he had just opened. She had to know. Elara packed her sheet music with trembling hands. She slipped on her coat, her movements automatic. Turning off the light, she plunged the practice room into darkness. Out in the hallway, the polished marble floor gleamed under the emergency lights, a testament to his work. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing. The academy felt like a museum after hours, a tomb for dreams. As she neared the main doors, she saw a dim light spilling from the open door of the groundskeeper's cluttered office. An older man was inside, sorting through keys on a large metal ring. This was the head groundskeeper, a man who had been at Van Clare since before she was born. He knew every brick, every creaky floorboard. She stopped in the doorway. "Excuse me?" The man looked up, his face friendly and wrinkled. "All done for the night, miss? Locking up soon? I?" "Yes," Elara said. She hesitated, her heart pounding. "How do you ask? Asterisk, do you know if the janitor is a secret piano god?" She took a breath. "The man who cleans the practice rooms at night. The quiet one. Do you know his name?" The groundskeeper's bushy eyebrows went up. "Leo? Sure. Keeps to himself. Good worker. Never a fuss." He went back to his keys. "Leo," Elara repeated. The name made him more real, and somehow even more mysterious. Has he worked her long?" "Oh, must be 15, 16 years now," the man said, not looking up. "Since the old headmaster's time. Took the job right after he arrived in the city." "Arrived from where?" The groundskeeper paused, his hands going still on the key ring. He looked at her properly now, his eyes narrowing slightly. He seemed to be weighing something. Why the sudden interestedness? Elara scrambled for a reason. "He found something I lost. A necklace." I wanted to thank him properly. The lie tasted bitter. The old man studied her face. He must have seen the genuine, desperate curiosity there, because his expression softened into something sad. He sighed and gestured for her to come in, closing the office door partway. "Look," he said, his voice dropping. "Leo's a private man. He's had his share of trouble. More than his share." He rubbed his chin. "You're a music student. You ever hear of a pianist named Leonid Vitrov?" The name meant nothing to her. She shook her head. "No, I suppose you wouldn't. It was before your time. A long time ago." The man's gaze drifted to a dusty, framed photo on the wall of a younger version of himself with an older man in a suit. Leonid Vitrov. Came from over in Europe somewhere. A real wunderkind, they said. Could make a piano sing like it was a human voice. Played with all the big orchestras. Had a brilliant future. He paused, and the air in the small office grew heavy. Then it all stopped. Just stopped. 20-some years ago. There was a terrible accident. A car, in the rain. The groundskeeper's voice became a near whisper. His wife was killed, and their little girl. She was, 7 or 8? I heard she was a prodigy too, just starting. Had her whole life ahead of her. Elara felt the breath leave her body. The floor seemed to tilt. The music she had heard, the crushing sorrow, the anger, the ghost of a lullaby in the high notes, it all made a horrible, devastating sense. Leo. Is Leonid Vitrov? She whispered. The groundskeeper nodded slowly. He showed up here a few years after, looking for any work. The old headmaster knew who he was. Gave him a job, no questions asked. A place to be quiet. He's been here ever since. The piano? He never goes near them. At least, I've never seen him. He cleans around them. He'll polish the wood, but he never touches the keys. He looked at her sharply. Why do you ask? Elara couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight. She just shook her head, a numb, slow movement. Be gentle with him, miss, the groundskeeper said, his tone firm now. That man, he's not just a janitor. He's a walking graveyard. The past is a locked room for him. Some doors are better left closed. You understand? She managed a weak nod. She mumbled a thanks and stumbled out of the office, through the grand doors, and into the cool night air. The walk home was a blur. The city lights swam around her. She didn't hear the traffic or the people. All she could hear was that music, now layered with the new, terrible truth. It wasn't just a sad song. It was a requiem, a memorial built from sound for a wife and a little girl who would never play again. She thought of her own frustrations, the missing heart in her Rachmaninoff. She felt a deep, aching shame. What did she know of heart? What did she know of real loss? She practiced in a safe, sunlit world of competitions and scholarships. Her music was a decoration. His music was a bone-deep scar, a language for a pain that had no other words. For the next 3 days, Alara moved through her classes like a ghost. She practiced, but her fingers felt dead on the keys. Every note she played seemed trivial, pointless. She saw Leo Leonid once, from a distance, emptying the recycling bin. He moved with that same slow, careful heaviness. He was once again just the janitor. But Alara saw the invisible weight he carried now. It was in the slope of his shoulders, in the way he looked at nothing. She knew the groundskeeper was right. The past was a locked room. But she had heard the music leaking out from under the door. And she couldn't pretend she hadn't. She couldn't go back to being the girl who mocked the invisible man. She had to say something. But what do you say to a ghost? "I'm sorry for your loss," felt like a pebble thrown into a bottomless canyon dot on the 4th night. She stayed late again. She didn't practice her pieces. Instead, she found a simple book of Chopin nocturnes. They were old, romantic, full of a softer melancholy. She chose the simplest one and began to play. But this time, she didn't play for perfection. She played slowly. She tried to listen to the spaces between the notes. She tried to feel the loneliness in the melody. Halfway through, she made a mistake. She hit a wrong chord. Instead of stopping in frustration, she did something she never did. She let the wrong note hang in the air, then slowly, softly, found her way back to the right one. It sounded less like a mistake and more like a stumble, a human hesitation. She finished the piece, her hands resting in her lap. The room was quiet. Then, from the doorway, she heard a voice. It was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Your phrasing," the voice said. "It is not a race." She turned. Leo stood there, leaning on his mop. He wasn't looking at her, but at the piano. "It is a conversation," he said, almost to himself. "Here at the turn." He hummed a few notes, his hum surprisingly tuneful. Slower, let it breathe. "It is sad, not angry." He fell silent, as if shocked he had spoken so many words. He made to move away. "Leonid?" Alara said softly. He froze as if she had struck him. He slowly turned his head, and his eyes met hers. There was a flash of panic in them, then a deep, resigned sorrow. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the hungry silence of the hall. The sound of his name hung in the air after he left. Alara sat perfectly still, the echo of it mixing with the ghost of the Chopin melody. She had called him by his real name, and he had not denied it. He had just nodded. That single, heavy nod felt like a key turning in a lock, one that had rusted shut decades ago. She didn't try to follow him. She knew a chaste animal when she saw one. The look in his eyes had been pure, raw alarm before it was buried under that familiar tiredness. So she stayed in the practice room, but she didn't play again. She just sat in the quiet, thinking about what he'd said. Asterisk, it is a conversation. Let it breathe. Asterisk, for the first time, she thought about the music as something alive, something with its own pulse. Not a puzzle to solve, but a creature to listen to. Her teacher's words asterisk. Where is the heart? Asterisk finally started to mean something. The heart wasn't a technical skill. It was patience. It was listening. It was allowing the sadness to be sad without rushing through it to get to the end. The next night, she came back. She didn't bring her Rachmaninoff. She brought the simple Chopin nocturne again. She played it slowly, thinking about each note as a word. She tried to make it a conversation with the empty room, with the memory of the music he had played. When she finished, there was no sound from the hall, no shadow in the doorway. She packed up and left, a strange mixture of disappointment and relief in her chest. She did the same thing the night after that, and the night after that. It became a new ritual. Not practicing, but speaking. Using the piano to ask a question she didn't know how to put into words. The question was, asterisk, I heard you. Do you hear me? Asterisk, on the fifth night, something changed. She was midway through the piece, focusing on a delicate, falling phrase, when she sensed a presence. She didn't turn. She kept playing, but her skin prickled. She could feel him standing in the doorway, listening. She fought the urge to play better, to perform. Instead, she tried to play more honestly. She let her fingers stumble a little on a quiet chord, a genuine imperfection. When the last note faded, she waited. She heard the soft scuff of a shoe on marble. The left hand, his voice came, quiet and rough from disuse. It is not an accompaniment. It is the foundation, the ground the melody walks on. Make it stronger. Here. He was still in the hallway, invisible to her, but he hummed a short series of bass notes, giving them a deeper, more resonant weight. Elara, her heart thumping, played this section again, doing as he said. Yes, the voice said from the dark. Just that one word. Then the soft scuffing footsteps moved away. It wasn't much, but it was everything. He was teaching her, not the janitor. Leonid Vitrov was teaching her. This fragile, wordless exchange became their routine. She would play something simple, something from the romantic era he would have known. Sometimes he would just listen and leave. Sometimes his voice would come from the shadows, a brief correction, a single insight that would unravel a knot she'd been fighting for weeks. Asterisk, this is not a storm. It is a sigh. You are telling the story to someone you love. Whisper it. Asterisk, he never came into the light. He never entered the room. He was a voice from the past, a ghost offering gifts. Elara stopped thinking about her competitions. She started listening to old recordings, trying to understand the world he came from. She listened for the heartache in the music, and now she could hear it everywhere. One rainy Tuesday, she took a risk. She found a piece by a composer she knew was from his homeland, a gentle, folk-like melody. She learned it clumsily, the unfamiliar scales feeling strange under her fingers. That night, she played it. She played it badly. Wrong notes, awkward rhythms. But she played it with a feeling of offering, a gesture of respect. When she finished, the silence from the hallway was long and deep. She thought she had gone too far, that she had broken their fragile thread. Then she heard the footsteps, not walking away. They came closer. He appeared in the doorway. He didn't have his mop. His hands were empty. He looked at the piano, then at her, his expression unreadable. That is a child's song, he said slowly. Alara's face flushed. I know. I'm sorry. I wanted to. From my country, he interrupted, not unkindly. He took a step into the room, then another. He stood beside the piano, looking down at the keys. You play it like a foreigner. All the notes are in the wrong places. For the first time, she saw something close to a flicker in his eyes. Not a smile, but the memory of one. The rhythm. It is like this. He reached out a single, calloused finger. He didn't sit. He just pressed one key, then another, tapping out a simple, rocking rhythm. Tap dash tap dash tap dash ta. It was livelier, more like a dance. It is a happy song, he said, his voice softer. For singing. For children to skip to. Elara tried to copy the rhythm. Her version was still stiff. He watched her hands, and then, almost without thinking, he reached out and gently tapped the back of her wrist. Relax. You hold the sadness in your hands. Let it go for this one. The touch was brief and electric. It was the first time he had made contact. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and tried again. This time, the rhythm flowed a little better. Better? He murmured. He stood there for a moment longer, watching her hands. Then, as if waking up, he blinked and stepped back towards the door. You learn, he said. It sounded like both an observation and a farewell. After that night, the door was open. Not all the way, but enough. Some nights he would lean in the doorway. Other nights he would take a few steps into the room. He never sat at the piano again. But he would point, he would hum, he would correct with a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Ilara stopped talking altogether during these sessions. She just listened. She became a sponge, absorbing every word, every gesture. She learned more about music in those 2 weeks than in the previous 2 years. She learned that dynamics weren't just loud and soft, but distant and close. That silence was part of the music. That every piece had a secret, a hidden story, and your job was to find it and tell it. One evening, she came in and found a single sheet of paper on the piano stand. It was not printed. It was handwritten in a beautiful, old-fashioned script, the notes drawn with a careful, flowing hand. There was no title. At the top, it simply said, "For the right hand alone." The melody was stunningly simple. A lullaby. 5 lines of music, no more. But the harmonies implied within it were complex and heartbreakingly sweet. It was an open door, an invitation. Her hands shook as she played it. It was technically easy, but to play it with the right feeling, that was the real task. She played it through once, too fast. She took a deep breath and played it again, thinking of his words. Let it breathe. She imagined it was for a child. For a specific child with dark hair and sleepy eyes. She didn't know if he was listening. She played it a 3rd time, pouring everything she had learned from him into those few simple lines. When she finished, she just sat there, her head bowed over the keys. A long minute passed. Then she heard him come in. He walked to the piano and stood beside her. He looked at the handwritten sheet, then at her. You play it well, he said quietly. There was a thickness in his voice. Then he did something that made her heart stop. He lowered himself onto the very edge of the bench, leaving a wide space between them. He reached out and placed his left hand on the lower keys. This is the harmony, he said, his voice a bare whisper. He played a single, deep, warm chord. It was the missing piece. The simple melody suddenly had roots, a foundation of profound love and safety. Now, he said. Tears sprang to Ilara's eyes. She placed her right hand over the lullaby notes. She began to play, and a moment later, his left hand joined hers. His harmony shifted and moved, weaving around her melody, supporting it, holding it up. It was a conversation, not with words, but with feeling. He was telling her the story of the lullaby. He was showing her the room where it was sung, the warmth of the light, the quiet love in the air. They played it together, the student and the master, the ghost and the girl. The music filled the small room, no longer a requiem of grief, but a fragile, living memory of love. When the last note faded, neither of them moved. The space on the bench between them no longer felt like a distance. It felt like a bridge that had just been built, note by note. The shared silence after the lullaby was different. Before, the quiet had been a wall or a deep, lonely well. Now, it felt like a held breath, a peaceful, understanding pause. They sat on the same bench, not looking at each other, just feeling the music fade from the air around them. He was the first to move. Leonid lifted his left hand from the keys and placed it back in his lap. He stared at his own rough fingers, as if seeing them for the first time. Alara watched him from the corner of her eye. The lines of grief on his face seemed softer in the warm glow of the piano lamp. Not gone, but gentler. "It is late," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. He stood up, the old stiffness returning to his movements. But it was different now. It wasn't the stiffness of a ghost. It was the stiffness of an old man who has sat still for a long time. "Thank you," Alara said, the words feeling too small. "For the music. For teaching me." He gave a small, slow nod, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second. There was no panic in them this time. Just a quiet, weary recognition. "You learn quickly," he said. Then he turned and walked out, leaving her alone with the handwritten lullaby on the stand-dot. Everything changed after that. The academy was no longer just a school. It was a shared, secret world. Leonid didn't hide in the hallway anymore. He would come into the practice room, sometimes even before she started playing. He would listen, then sit beside her on the bench. Not close, but close enough that she could see the concentration in his eyes, the way his jaw moved slightly as he thought about the music. He started giving her real lessons. Not just corrections, but principles. "Music is not about the notes you play," he said one evening as she struggled with a stormy Beethoven passage. "It is about the notes you do not play. The silence is the canvas. The sound is the paint. You are using too much paint. You are covering up the canvas." He played the opening bars, his touch powerful but controlled, leaving breathing room between the chords. The storm suddenly had shape, purpose. It wasn't just noise. He taught her about weight. Your arm from the shoulder. Let it fall. The finger is just the messenger. The power comes from here. He would tap his own shoulder. He taught her about color. This phrase is not loud. It is bright. Make it shine. This one is dark velvet. Make it deep and soft. Alara stopped being the prodigy. She became the apprentice. She shed her old, perfectionist skin. She allowed herself to be wrong, to be messy, to try things that felt strange. Under his guidance, the heart her teacher had begged her to find began to beat. It was a shaky, new heartbeat, but it was there. She could feel it in her chest when she played the Chopin with the right aching slowness. She could see it in Leonid's slow nod of approval that one night she brought the Rachmaninoff, the beast that had started it all. She was nervous. This was the piece she had failed at, the piece she had been playing when she had thrown her cruel challenge at him. "Play," was all he said. She took a deep breath and began. She didn't try to be perfect. She tried to tell the story. She remembered his lessons: weight, color, silence. She played through the first difficult movement, and when she finished, her hands were trembling, but not from fatigue. From feeling Leonid was quiet for a long time. He looked out the dark window, his reflection floating in the glass over the city lights. "My daughter," he said, and the words were so soft they were almost swept away by the hum of the radiator. She loved this piece. She was too small to play it, of course. Her hands were like little birds. But she would make me play it. She called it the dragon music. She said the low notes were the dragon sleeping, and the fast notes were it running through the sky. A faint, almost invisible smile touched his lips, then vanished. She would conduct me from her chair. With a pencil. Alara didn't dare speak. She didn't even breathe. He blinked, coming back to the room. He looked at the piano. "You play the dragon well now. It is not a machine anymore. It has fire. It has a heart." He turned his pale eyes to her. "That is good." It was the greatest compliment she had ever received. The seasons began to turn outside the high windows. The fierce summer heat softened into autumn. The secret lessons continued. They rarely spoke of personal things. Their language was music. A difficult passage was a mountain to climb. A beautiful melody was a clear stream. Sad music was a gray sky. It was enough. Then the announcement came. The Van Clare Annual Winter Gala. It was the biggest event of the year. The hall would be packed with wealthy patrons, famous alumni, and agents. For the top students, it was a chance to launch a career. Ilara's teacher had put her name forward months ago. She was to play the complete Rachmaninoff sonata. The dragon music, the old fear came rushing back. The pressure, the need to be flawless, the image of all those critical eyes watching her. For weeks, she had been playing for one silent, listening man in a small room. Now she had to play for a crowd. She tried to practice as usual, but the old habits crept in. The technical demon returned. She started racing, forcing, worrying about mistakes. She could feel herself turning back into the machine. Leonid noticed immediately. He listened for one evening session, his brow furrowed. He didn't offer any musical advice. He just said, "You are playing for them again." "I have to," Ilara said, frustration edging her voice. "This is my chance. Everyone will be there." "Everyone was always there," he replied calmly. "Even when it was just you, and the piano, and the silence. The music does not change because the room is bigger. You do." He left her with that, but it was no use. As the gala night drew closer, Ilara's playing grew tighter, more anxious. The heart she had found began to retreat, hiding behind a wall of fear. The night before the gala, she had a full dress rehearsal on the big stage in the main hall. The empty, velvet-seated auditorium felt like a giant mouth waiting to swallow her. She played, and it was technically proficient, but it was empty. It was the old her. Her teacher, sitting in the third row, called out, "Better, Ilara. Clean. Just keep it clean and you'll be fine." Clean. The word felt like an insult. She wanted to be on fire, not clean. Dejected, she walked back to the practice wing, still in her rehearsal clothes. The building was deserted. Everyone had gone home to rest for the big night. As she passed the familiar practice room, she saw a sliver of light under the door. She pushed it open. Leonid was there. He wasn't cleaning. He was just sitting on the piano bench, in his work clothes, his hands resting on his knees. It was as if he was waiting for her. "I heard," he said. From the hallway, Ilara leaned against the doorframe, suddenly exhausted. It was terrible. "I'm going to fail. I'm going to play like a robot in front of everyone, and they'll all know I'm a fraud." He didn't offer false comfort. He didn't tell her she would be great. He looked at the piano, then at her. "Why do you play?" he asked. The question surprised her. "Because. It's what I do. It's who I am." "That is not a reason," he said. "That is a habit." "Why do you play the music?" "That piece. The dragon." She thought about it. She thought about the joy she'd felt discovering its secret colors with him. The sorrow she now understood lived in its depths. "Because it's beautiful, and sad, and powerful. It feels true." He nodded slowly. "Then play that. Play the truth." He stood up and walked towards her. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment she thought he might put a hand on her shoulder. He didn't. He just looked at her with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. "You asked me once to play you something," he said, his voice gravelly. A foolish challenge from a girl who knew nothing. "Now, I ask you, play for me. Not for them. Not for a chance. Play for the girl who learned to listen. Play for the joy you found in a simple lullaby. That is the only reason to ever sit at this instrument." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stepped past her and into the dark hall. Leaving her alone with the piano, and the most important question she had ever been asked. She sat at the bench. She didn't play. She just thought about his words. Play for the joy you found. She thought of the lullaby, the first real conversation they'd had. She thought of the dragon sleeping and running through the sky for a little girl with a pencil. The crushing weight of the gala, the audience, her future. It didn't vanish, but it moved. It moved to the side. In the center, there was just the music. The true, beautiful, sad dragon music. She placed her hands on the keys, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid. The night of the gala arrived, and the Van Clare Hall was transformed. Crystal chandeliers blazed, casting a shimmering light over women in silk and men in dark suits. The air smelled of perfume and polished wood. Backstage was a chaotic whisper of rustling dresses, nervous scales on violins, and the low thrum of anxiety. Alara stood in her simple black dress, peering through the heavy velvet curtain. She saw the sea of faces, the critical eyes, the program books flipping to her name. Rachmaninoff Piano Sonata No. 2. The old terror, cold and slick, started to rise in her chest. Her fingers felt like ice. Then she remembered the quiet practice room. She remembered the lullaby. She remembered his words. Play for the joy you found. She took a deep breath, not to steady her nerves for the crowd, but to find the quiet place inside her where the music lived. She wasn't Alara, the prodigy about to perform. She was just a person, about to tell a story. When her name was called, she walked onto the vast stage. The spotlight was hot and blinding, turning the audience into a dark, shapeless mass. She sat at the magnificent concert grand, a giant, gleaming beast. For a second, it felt alien. Then she placed her hands on the keys, and they were just keys. The same as the ones in the small room upstairs. She began. The first notes were a murmur, a dragon stirring in its cave. She didn't attack them. She let them emerge from the silence, just as he had taught her. She felt the weight of her arm from the shoulder, her fingers merely the messengers. As the music unfolded, she didn't think about the technique. She thought about the story. The sorrowful, singing melody was a loss she could now understand. The furious, crashing chords were a storm of grief, not a show of strength. She was playing for him, for the man in the shadows who had given the music back its heart. She played for the little girl who thought it was a dragon. She poured every lesson, every moment of understanding, into the notes. She left spaces for the silence. She found the colors, the dark velvet, the bright, shining tears. She was so deep inside the music that she didn't see the side door of the auditorium open a crack. She didn't see the old janitor, still in his work trousers and plain shirt, slip in and stand in the deepest shadows at the very back of the hall, near the exit. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, and listened. As she moved into the final tumultuous movement, something unexpected happened. A phrase from Leonid's own music, from the heartbreaking requiem he had played that first night, wove itself into her mind. It fit. It was a cry of pain that understood the dragon's rage. In a moment of pure instinct, during a brief improvisational passage, she let her left hand echo a fragment of that phrase. It was a subtle thing, a ghost of his grief passing through her music. A public thank you whispered in a private language. She finished. The final chord hung in the air, a deep, resonant boom that faded into absolute silence. Then the applause erupted. It was a wave of sound, loud and warm and sustained. People rose to their feet. Alara, breathing heavily, stood and bowed. The spotlight was in her eyes, but her heart was somewhere else entirely. She had done it. She had played the truth. Backstage was a blur of congratulations from other students and proud handshakes from her teacher. Magnificent, Alara. The heart. You finally found it. but the praise felt distant, like hearing a conversation through a wall. Her eyes kept searching the crowded backstage area, looking for a worn face, a pair of tired eyes. He wasn't there. A deep sadness washed over her. Had he not come? Had he not heard? Then the headmaster, a dignified man with silver hair, took the stage. The applause died down. "Thank you, he said, his voice echoing in the hall. "What a stunning display of talent we have witnessed tonight." He spoke about the future of music, about the bright young stars of Van Clare. Then he paused, and his expression grew solemn, more personal. "Music," he said, "is not only about the future. It is also about memory. And sometimes the most profound voices among us choose silence." He looked out over the audience, towards the very back of the hall. Many years ago, this academy offered a refuge. Not just a job, but a safe harbor for a wounded soul who had lost everything to silence his music. We have been privileged to have him here, a guardian of these halls, a keeper of our spaces. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Elara, standing in the wings, felt her pulse quicken. The headmaster went on. "Some of you may know him as Leo, our night janitor. But to those who remember a brighter, more painful time, he is Leonid Vetrov." A gasp came from the older members of the audience. Whispers of Vetrov? Is it possible? Spread like a breeze. "Tonight," the headmaster continued, his voice gentle but firm, "after decades of silence, I believe we have all heard an echo of his gift. And perhaps it is time for more than an echo." He turned his body fully towards the back shadows. "Leonid, my old friend, the stage is yours, if you wish it." Every head in the auditorium turned. The spotlight operator, confused, swung the bright beam away from the stage and swept it towards the back wall. It searched, and then it found him. There he stood, pinned in the sudden, glaring light. He looked exposed, like a creature startled in the woods. He flinched, raising a hand to shield his eyes. He was still in his cleaning clothes, a simple worn shirt against the sea of silk and tuxedos. For a terrible moment, Elara thought he would bolt, that he would vanish out the door and never return. He lowered his hand. He stood very still. He looked across the vast distance of the hall, past the hundreds of staring faces, and his gaze found Elara in the wings. She couldn't see his expression clearly, but she gave him the smallest, most encouraging nod she could muster. He looked at the grand piano on the stage, gleaming under the lights. He looked at the headmaster. Then he took a step forward, and another. He began to walk down the long central aisle. The silence was absolute. There was no rustle, no cough, only the soft, steady sound of his work shoes on the carpet. He walked slowly, with that same old heaviness, but his back was straight. He did not look at the people he passed. He kept his eyes on the stage. He climbed the steps. He walked to the piano. He stood beside it for a long moment, looking at the keys. The whole world was holding its breath. Then he sat. He adjusted the bench. He placed his hands in his lap, just as he had in the practice room that first night. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he was no longer looking at the audience. He was somewhere else. His hands rose and descended. He did not play the requiem. He did not play the storm of grief that Elara had first heard. He began with the lullaby, the simple 5-line melody he had written for her. But now he played it fully with both hands. The harmony he had taught her blossomed around it, richer and more complex than before. It was no longer just a memory of love. It was a love that had survived. It had weathered the storm. The melody repeated, and he began to vary it, to build upon it. He wove in strands of light, of resilience. A phrase that had once sounded only of loss now turned, slowly, into something bittersweet and hopeful. It was a transformation, happening right there in front of him. He was playing his way out of the tomb of his own silence. The music grew, not in volume, but in depth and spirit. It became a new piece, a piece that acknowledged the past, that bowed to its pain, but that also looked up, towards the sky he had once shown to a little girl. It was a song of survival. When he finished, the final note was not a whisper, but a clear, quiet statement of peace. For a second, nothing. Then the applause began. It started slowly, from the older patrons who remembered, who understood the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Then it built, rolling through the hall like thunder, becoming a roaring, tearful, standing ovation. People were crying openly. Leonid did not bow. He simply sat, his head bowed, listening to the sound of his music returned to him by 1,000 hands. After a moment, he stood. He looked once more at Alara, and this time she saw his face clearly. There were tears on his weathered cheeks, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes, were clear. For the first time, they were not empty. He gave her a small, tired, genuine smile. Then he turned and walked off the stage, not back down the aisle, but into the wings where she stood. He stopped in front of her. The noise of the crowd was still deafening all around them. "You played the dragon perfectly," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar. "You played the morning after," she replied, her own eyes swimming. He nodded. He reached out, and this time he did place a hand on her shoulder. The touch was firm, real, a connection. "Thank you," he said. And then he walked past her, down the quiet back corridor, towards the practice wing, leaving the storm of applause behind. Alara knew he wasn't going to clean. He was going to sit in the quiet, familiar room and just be. And she knew, with a certainty that filled her with a quiet joy, that the lessons were not over. They had only just begun. Not as a prodigy and a janitor, but as two musicians, one at the end of a long night and one at the beginning of a new day.